Hi guys, it's me Ria, and this is going to be another episode of Bunka, where I will be talking to you about Japanese culture in Aotearoa. So today's episode is about a small town in the Wairarapa named Featherston. And this is very close to Wellington, and it's just kind of at the foot of the Rumitaka range. And Featherston has an interesting history tied to Japan and Japanese culture because during World War II, little known to a lot of the New Zealand population, there was a Japanese prisoner of war camp there. And although I know quite a few parts of this story, I actually went to Wairarapa and talked to one of the men who works at the Wairarapa Archives, who is currently working on a book regarding Featherston as a training camp in World War I, but also as the prisoner of war camp that it was in World War II. And so instead of me telling you this story, I'm going to tell you this story with the help of Mark Pacey from the Wairarapa Archives. So welcome, Mark. You can introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about Wairarapa Archives.
Yeah, so name's Mark Pacey, work at the Wairarapa Archive, been there about 5 years now. Primarily we deal with the public, so public come in, they have an inquiry about whether it's a house, whether it's a person, things like that. We then go dig through what we've got, hopefully have something for them. It doesn't always happen, unfortunately. People seem to think we have a record for everything. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. But yeah, that's the main part of the job, is people come in, ask a question about something, and we try and find the answers. No two inquiries are the same. Someone will come in asking about an ancestor. Someone will come in saying, I've got this violin, what's it worth? People coming in saying, I saw a UFO, I wanted to tell somebody. We get all sorts of people coming in. No 2 days are the same. You're like, what's the next person going to come and ask for? Because it's really interesting.
And so you're obviously based in the Wairarapa, but the Wairarapa Archives are in Masterton. Are you from the area?
So my family is. So on Mum's side, they've been here since 1854. But Mum moved away in, I think that's the early 1970s, and moved to Hawke's Bay. And then I grew up in Hawke's Bay. Then I moved back down here. So I've got some strong ties here, but I visited here as on holiday and things, and grandparents lived here. And
so why Featherston? What made you want to write and research the World War I camp and the prisoner of war camp?
My extensive interest in military history. So I've always been interested in military history, but it was more so the Pacific theatre of the Second World War, because on Dad's side of the family, he's Australian, they were involved in the Pacific War. So that was the sort of one that I sort of veered towards.
And was it through your dad's family that you started to have interest in military history?
Yeah, so it was through Dad, and it was through his mother's brother, who was in the Pacific War, and he was captured by the Japanese and became a prisoner and was sent to work on the railway. So I researched into that one, trying to find out more about him, what happened to him, because we didn't know. We just knew he was caught, and that was it. Did he die? Does he have a grave? He did actually die on the railway, and he does have a grave in Kanchanaburi Cemetery in Thailand, which is on my to-do list, is to go and visit it. Yeah. But researching what he did and what his experiences were, that made me a whole lot more interested in the Pacific theatre. And then, of course, you're like, well, what else can you do with it? And then eventually I went to university and studied that and sort of started veering towards the military history, but the Pacific theatre of that.
And which university was that?
Massey University, yeah. But I did it extramurally. I did a double major in history and defence studies. So the history covers all the history. The defence studies is done by the sort of defence force, and they teach you tactics and military law and international military law. They give you a copy of the Geneva Convention, which is 2 folders, sort of 2 inches thick each. So you've got to go through that. It's interesting, and it was good to get that side of things as well, because they do cover history and stuff. That was really, really good. It gave me a really, really broad base from which to launch from.
And so then at some point, obviously, when you were interested in the Pacific theatre in World War II, I suppose that kind of led you into having an interest in Japanese military practices and history.
When I was at university, I specifically did a paper on Japanese culture, just so you could understand, what their culture is in regards to when they came here, or even the military stuff, like what they did when they were, in the Pacific. They said, oh, they were nasty, they did all this. Yeah, but why? Because that's the way they were taught. I do have a copy of Senjinkun, and I have gone through and read all of that.
And do you mind explaining what Senjinkun is?
Yeah, so it's basically the Japanese sort of code of how you conduct yourself in warfare, called Senjinkun. I think it was written by Hideki Tosho. And it basically, one of the blatant rules is you must never face the shame of becoming a prisoner. So if you're in war, if you go off to war, you either come back victorious or you don't come back at all. So when the Japanese, when they're leaving to go away to war and they're saying goodbye to their families, they're being quite literal. A lot of them just weren't expecting to come back at all.
So then I suppose at some point when you were thinking about the area, about the Wairarapa and Masterton, Featherston popped up.
So I mean, when I moved here, then you start putting feelers out. What's the military history around Wairarapa? And of course they straight away say Featherston, and then of course you find out there was a Japanese prisoner of war camp here. You immediately go, oh, I'm interested in that. I want to know more.
Yeah, I find that when I tell people about it, when I talk about it, a lot of people just didn't know it ever existed. It's almost like it's been wiped from mainstream history. And you had roots here growing up and you had family here. Like, did you ever hear about it before?
Not really. I mean, my grandparents were here. They may have mentioned it a little bit, so I sort of knew of it. Didn't know any details about it.
And so really, did you only really find out about the details of the camp and the incident and things like that? Was that more recent?
The details of it probably when I started work at the archive, probably, maybe just slightly before that. More people know about the World War I camp. More people know that New Zealanders went there to train to go overseas for World War I. They don't necessarily know that even on exactly the same site, there was a World War II camp that held prisoners of war.
And why do you think that not many people know about the camp?
Possibly because not a lot's been done on it. There's been a few newspaper articles and things, and there were one or two TV specials back in the day. So not a lot's been done. Maybe because people don't want to talk about it, and a lot of the records were sort of embargoed for a long time. And then, of course, having been to the archive and looked at the records, there's boxes and boxes and boxes of it. Unless you're a die-hard researcher, you're not going to go through the whole lot to see all the details of what happened there. Someone needs to write a book on it, which of course is not going to happen, but until that actually happens, all the other sort of details, they're going to be murky.
Okay, so I think we've kind of given a bit of a background now. Do you want to tell us kind of the story of how Japanese people ended up in the Wairarapa in Featherston?
In August of 1942, the Americans invaded Guadalcanal because they'd done aerial reconnaissance and they found out that they were building an airstrip there. And if the Japanese were able to finish this airstrip, it would threaten the supply line to Australia. So they had to retake it, take Guadalcanal and occupy the airstrip. So they sent an invasion force in, they landed, and they took the airstrip pretty much with no casualties. And they took a whole lot of prisoners. The prisoners that they took were engineers. Some of them were sort of coerced into it. Most of them weren't actually Japanese. They were probably Korean or something. And suddenly they've got these prisoners. They can't keep them on the island. So I thought, well, okay, New Zealand's just over there. Let's send them to New Zealand. So they send this radio message across and say, okay, we've got this boat. We're bringing some prisoners. You need to put them in a prison camp. They're like, okay, give us some time. We'll build a camp. They're like, no, they're on their way now. They'll be arriving like in a few weeks. So, New Zealand didn't have a facility to keep them, but they had this land in Featherston. So they put up a fence around where the old camp was in Featherston and then initially put them in tents and slowly built up the camp around them. So that first group that came over, they were the labourers. They were fine. They were just happy not to be in the war anymore. But as the war in Guadalcanal progressed and some of the vessels started to get sunk, so there was the Furutaka, Kirishima, these big Japanese warships, suddenly you've got these Japanese prisoners of war, these sailors, the really sort of hardcore military guys. Then they were coming over and they were a different group. But it was broken up into sort of 4 compounds. There wasn't just one camp, it was one camp divided up into 4. So you'd keep the labourers over here, the officers over there, and the general sailors over there.
So how many prisoners do you think there were kind of total?
Estimates are around 800. I don't know exactly how many of them were Japanese. I'd have to consult my notes, but a few hundred at least were the Japanese military guys. So eventually the camp built up and built up as the prisoners also built up. They didn't all come over in one group. They came over in smaller batches. But yeah, so that first group, they were fine. If it was only them, there wouldn't have been an incident. But it was these other prisoners, these Japanese, that didn't want to be prisoners because they weren't supposed to be prisoners. That's where the sort of tension came into it. So it was within only a couple of months of them arriving that the incident actually happened.
So yeah, when I started working with Featherston and the Heritage Museum, I was actually on an internship to write an education resource. So I wrote a fair amount about the history in the area. And I found it so strange that there was this kind of cryptic messaging behind the incident, you know. It's such an interesting thing to call what happened, and people kind of nonchalantly say the incident, and I think it doesn't really carry the weight of what actually happened. But do you want to tell us about the incident?
It's been called a riot. It's been called all kinds of things. According to Senjinkun, which is sort of the rules around warfare, you're not allowed to become a prisoner, but you're also not allowed to do anything that will help the enemy. And the whole incident really happened around this group of prisoners being asked to go outside of the camp and do work. And doing work for the enemy is helping the enemy, so they didn't want to do that. So initially they all just thought, we're not going to do this, we'll all just sit down and just stage a sit-down protest. It wasn't violent, they just didn't want to help the enemy because they weren't supposed to help the enemy, that's what they were taught. And so they were all sitting down. The New Zealand guards were getting upset that they weren't moving because the New Zealand guards, they were either older guys or guys too young to go over war, not necessarily very experienced, whereas these Japanese guys are very experienced in warfare. There were officers sitting amongst all the people sitting down. The New Zealanders thought, well, let's get the officers out. That might help things. Of course, it made things a whole lot worse because all the others stood up and protected the officers. That's when tension started to rise and rise and rise. There was yelling, shouting. Some of the Japanese started throwing stones, and eventually, however it happened, they all sort of rushed forward, and these panicking New Zealanders started shooting. But yeah, there's various stories around how it actually started. Like one of them was, it wasn't Adams, it was one of the New Zealand officers, whose name escapes me, supposedly fired a warning shot and then fired at Adachi, who was one of the officers, and actually hit him, and that's when they all charged.
When I was researching the incident, I came across some kind of rumours, I suppose, within the archives at the museum that said that, one of the guards had a brother who was decapitated or something like that. Do you think there's any weight to that story?
I've heard that story, but I've found no evidence. And to actually have that much detail that he was specifically on this island, specifically decapitated, that information wouldn't have filtered back until well after the war, if there were still eyewitnesses that would have said something. Yeah, because we've been researching this. He wants revenge, you killed my brother, I'm going to kill his brother. If he was it would say missing. That's what would, that happened to my uncle. He was on Indonesia trying to hold it with very, very minimal gear. The Japanese invaded and the family was just told he's missing. And that's all they had for years.
Yeah, I agree. When I was reading about it, I kind of thought it seemed a little bit too, narrated, too movie-esque. Like it had been embellished through the whisper mill or whatever the saying is. And yeah, I think maybe he just, there is the chance that he thought his brother had been captured, and there were all these rumors flying about what happens when you're captured by the Japanese, and maybe that was going through his head.
It was well known they could be quite barbaric. But so I mean, if your family member was captured, all kinds of things would go through your head about what's actually happening to him. So I mean, it is possible that they thought, well, he's being tortured or something, and then get, obviously very, very upset about that, and you'd want revenge for that.
So I find that when it comes to Senjinkun, it can be quite hard to explain to Kiwis, to European people, but it really comes down to kind of a mental state and beliefs that were drilled into Japanese people and Japanese soldiers by having such a strong military history in the country. So to explain and understand that idea of preferring death is quite hard to understand and to explain. And yeah, it comes down to those different psychological levels, I suppose.
The word honour, it means so much more in Japanese than it does in European culture and New Zealand culture. We think of honour, we think, oh, okay, yeah. But to them, it's held with much, much higher esteem. So to have that honour taken away, it's very, very hard for Europeans to understand what that means to a Japanese person. So there were some. I think it was Mishiharu Shinya. He was on, I think it was the Furutaka, which was a Japanese cruiser. When that was sunk, he was in the water, sort of quite a distance from the land. So he was in there. An American ship came along and they said, we'll rescue you. And he swam away from that ship, and he actually said in English, no thanks. Basically, leave me alone, leave me to die. I don't want to be rescued by you. So he would rather die in the sea than be rescued after his ship had been sunk, because of that sort of mentality of what they believed in that. And there was another one who actually was brought on board, and he was a prisoner, and he actually tried to make himself a wooden knife to kill himself with while he was a prisoner, because they wanted to keep that honour. They didn't want to shame themselves, they didn't want to shame their families of having been a prisoner.
And so at the camp, do you think there was issues with suicide and those aspects of, poor mental health and giving up on wanting to live?
Suicides and things? Yes, they did. They actually had an area of the camp there that was basically the suicide watch. The guys that are most at risk of potentially killing themselves, they put them in one area and kept an eye on them to make sure that they wouldn't.
I mean, this is hard to phrase, but why do you think that they tried to prevent that at all? They shot at some of them and killed them. So why were they trying to stop them from committing suicide?
We value human life differently than the Japanese do. I mean, to them, they basically think they're already dead.
Yeah. I mean, in some respects, it was worse than death.
Yeah, I mean, they were given the opportunity to write letters home, and tell their families, I'm okay, I'm alive, I'm in New Zealand, and they didn't do it because they didn't want their family to know.
And there's also that part of the story that says that a lot of the captured prisoners actually gave false names.
So there are several lists in the archives that have a list, and they're all numbered, of all the names of all the soldiers and what their job was and what vessel they were on and things. And yeah, you look at some of them and they're like, well, I know who that guy is, and that's not his name. Yeah. So Adachi's name is something different. I can't remember exactly what it is. But at the time when they were initially captured, they all just thought, well, let's all do fake names so no one knows. It was a booklet, and it was done by one of the prisoners, and it's called Fake Named Soldiers, I think is the name of the little booklet. Shokichiro Iwasa was his name, and he was on the Furutaka.
And the incident aside, it seems as though there were quite a few accounts that said that it wasn't always tense and it wasn't always horrible.
I mean, they were treated really, really well. They ate really well. They were supplied with good clothes. I think they were supplied with books and all sorts of other things. New Zealand adhered very strongly to the Geneva Convention. whereas the Japanese didn't.
Yeah.
But I mean, they had their reasons for doing that. They weren't just being nasty. They didn't actually ratify the Geneva Convention. I think they signed it, but they didn't ratify it. So I mean, one of the reasons behind their treatment of prisoners of war is they had the same mentality. It's like, you shouldn't become a prisoner of war. It's shameful. So when all these allies started sort of surrendering to them, they were embarrassed for them. They're like, well, why are you surrendering? You should be fighting to the last man. They couldn't understand why the allies didn't fight the way they did. So, I mean, it doesn't excuse some of the treatment that happened, but it does explain some of the mentality. They weren't being nasty. That's what they believed, and that's what they thought others believed as well.
I mean, there are some accounts from both prisoners and guards which have said the dynamic wasn't always so bad.
Yeah, Mishiharu Shinya, he wrote a book. The first one was called something about Guadalcanal was in the title, and then he reworked it. But yeah, Mishiharu Shinya, there was actually a few of them. Starting in the 1970s, these Japanese prisoners started to come back to New Zealand. So it's weird. A lot of Japanese, in terms of the war, if they were prisoners, they would just erase it. They would forget about it because it was shameful. But in terms of Featherston, a lot of them would come back here specifically to remember their time in the war, which is quite unusual for a Japanese that was captured, because it was so shameful they would just want to forget about it. It was just a bad thing. But they specifically came back to New Zealand because they liked it here. I mean, there's humorous stories. Like I'll have to dig into it more, because it's a side project at the moment. But there was a Japanese, he escaped, and he went off into the bush. But then of course he's like, well, it's cold. I've got no food. So he basically came back, handed himself in, said, I'm cold and hungry. So there's stories like that which don't really get told. And there was another one. One of the jobs that they had in the camp was creating things made out of concrete. So they made the curbstones, of which there's a few in Featherston, and they made the fire surrounds. So they would have these molds. They would pour concrete into them, and they would set it. And then they would stack the finished product near a fence. And these Japanese thought it'd be a bit of a laugh. They stacked them against the fence in sort of a staircase. And then one of them thought it'd be a laugh when the guard's walking along. He's like, right. And he climbed up to the top of the staircase and said hello from the top of the fence down at this guy. Like, okay. So they had a sense of humour. Apart from that one incident, after that, it seems to be quite amicable. I mean, they seem to get along quite fine. They had a few laughs. I mean, there's that famous photo where there's that scrawny little Japanese guy and the big Māori guard, and you can see them there. The conversation, you can see it in their faces. They seem to be having a great time. But starting in the 1970s, these Japanese prisoners, there was more than one. There was a few of them. They would come back. They would go to where the camp was and say, oh, this is where that was and this is where that was. They would bring their families with them and just explain their wartime experience there, which is highly unusual in terms of other theatres where they were captured and made prisoner.
So one of the reasons why I got brought onto the project with the museum in Featherston was because of the art that the prisoners had been making and my own background in art history. And it kind of attests to the fact that they had a little bit of free time and they got to do kind of recreational activities, that they were creating quite a lot of art. Do you know much about that?
I own a piece of that. I was,
oh, really?
I saw one it was on Trade Me, and it was so it's the New Zealand Onward badge, which is the standard badge that they had on their hats and things. So it's got the ferns, it's got NZ on it, and if you look at what it is, it's specifically part of a New Zealand uniform. So one of the guards would have asked one of the prisoners, "Can you make this for me? And I'll give you some cigarettes or some food, whatever." There was like a sort of a trading thing going on. Some of them did it just because they liked the guys.
And I guess there was also the currency that was floating around the camps, which maybe they could have paid them in.
There were 4 coins, and they had the hole in the middle. And it was specifically for use in internment camps, not just Featherston, they were used in Australia as well. The museum has 1 or 2 examples. They're quite cool. I've considered buying some, but there's so many replicas out there now. I don't want to pay $200 for a copy.
So from memory, the prisoners were building stuff for the camp which used Kiwi materials and like New Zealand wood and things like that. And then with the scraps and the leftovers, they were able to create other things.
Yeah. So the onward badge I've got, if you actually look at it, you can see it would have taken hours and hours, and it looks like it's been made. Someone had a sort of a 4-inch flathead nail, and they used to scratch it. They used the back of the nail, so the round head, to actually make a sort of a fish scale almost design on it, where they've just punched the head into the wood, and you can see the sort of circular design on it, which is just, it's made with the most simple things. It would have taken an enormous amount of time. They even found power shell somewhere and cut out little bits of power shell and inlaid it into this thing. So when I saw it for sale, I'm like, I'm buying that. But it would have taken so long to do. But yeah, the sort of story behind it would have obviously been made for a New Zealand Guard or something. Yeah, I loved it. So there's a few variations on it, but I've never seen one quite like this one before.
Yeah, and again, like if you go visit the museum, there's games and things that have been carved as well.
Yeah. So I think there's mahjong sets. There's Go Ban, the Japanese game. I think they've made some of those. One of the things that they strike in prisoner of war camps is boredom. So I mean, there was a workshop there, and there was things that they could do, but it's in the downtime, what do you do?
From like a museum perspective and a collection perspective, it's actually so unique because it's Japanese style and traditional objects that are made out of native New Zealand woods, and you just won't find that anywhere else in the world. Not from that time period anyway.
Yeah, so the one that I have, it's made out of rimu. You ask around, and every other person you ask, they go, oh yeah, I've got a piece of that. And he goes, oh, my dad's got 3 or 4 of them. There's a lot of it out there. They made a lot of stuff. They got there in, was it late 42? They didn't leave until the very end of 1945. Okay. So, just over 3 years, really. They were there for quite a long time.
So we talked about the prisoners who came back, but there were also quite a few Japanese people who still come and visit Featherston. Like, what do you think they're looking for when they go?
Possibly to pay some respects, because it's the site is done very, very well with all the cherry trees as well, representing the Japanese that had died there. I mean, that would be unheard of on some other places. But the fact that it happened here is very unusual and very unique, and I think they appreciate that New Zealand went to that length and actually, returned bodies and showed them respect, earned respect.
Yeah, and some of the museum volunteers told me that pre-COVID, annually or biannually, a Japanese choir would come and visit as well.
It was a naval choir, I believe. You see them prop up in the newspapers. So I've trawled through all the papers, and every article I find relating to the camp, I'll print it out and keep a copy of it. And I've got an enormous stack of them now. Quite a lot of that is about the Japanese choir coming in.
It also feels as though the museum itself is embracing a bit more of the Japanese prisoners and the aspects of their history that occurred on the site of the Featherston camp as well.
Because when they were talking about doing the memorials around Featherston for the Japanese, the RSA got very, very upset about this. Because some of their members and things went overseas, and they were killed by the Japanese, and they said, well, why are you doing a memorial to them? And they opposed it for years. It took a while for it to actually finally happen. So there was, of course, that resentment from a lot of New Zealanders. Why are you doing a memorial to Japanese in New Zealand? So after the war, Adachi became sort of a religious person. He became a priest, I think. But when he came back, he was allowed to perform the rites on the land to put the spirits to rest, which was, again, it's a very nice gesture on the New Zealanders' part. Let them do their religious thing on this piece of land where this thing happened, by showing respect to the culture and understanding the culture there. So New Zealand sort of went that extra step to help the Japanese with what happened there. The Japanese talk about it in terms of the Pacific War with America, and obviously at the time they were trying to kill each other, but in the years afterwards, the relationship has completely changed, and it was one Japanese veteran actually said, Japan and America are brothers and should act like it.
I mean, coming from a perspective of somebody with Japanese heritage and Kiwi heritage, it's nice to see that aspect of peace and forgiveness and, truce between two countries and letting go of the past and what happened during the war, because so many people within the war are just players of a country, not necessarily on purpose. And I guess in terms of the incident, nobody's ever really going to know exactly why or what happened, but it did happen, and it was one day within so many days.
People always ask, they say, well, why did it happen? And it really comes down to a sort of a fundamental misunderstanding between the two cultures. So the New Zealanders couldn't understand, why aren't these Japanese doing what we tell them to do? They said, well, because technically they're not allowed to do what you're telling them to do. It also comes down to certain words. They might mean something in English, but they mean a whole lot more in Japanese, like the word honour. It's so much different in Japanese.
Yeah, I definitely find that learning Japanese, you discover a lot of the ways in which one word means 8 different things. Whereas in English, when you say something, it's fairly face value on what you're trying to say. And a lot of concepts in Japanese culture have those levels of nuance where it's expected that you just know what's appropriate.
The idea of losing face with someone, to a New Zealander, what does that mean? They have no idea. But to a Japanese, that's extremely important.
Okay, so now tell us a little bit about your book.
So I'm not saying I'm not doing the only one, there have been books written on the Featherston prisoner of war camp. The best one was written, I think, back in the 70s. And it was written about Cowra and Featherston. And the lady who actually wrote that knew Japanese culture and explained it all really, really well.
Cowra being the Japanese prisoner of war camp that was in Australia.
Yeah, so they've sort of done a memorial type thing as well. I'm sure they donated the land to Japan as well.
Yeah, so there have been a few different texts written. I'm pretty sure Richard Bullen from the University of Canterbury was working on one as well, but mainly focused on the art aspect of what the prisoners were making.
So what I'm planning on doing is to basically go all the way back to the beginning and do a definitive book on the whole thing. So, you start off talking about when the war started, where these Japanese and Korean and other labourer came from, what their sort of philosophies and what their culture was, so that when you come to talk about the incident, you've got a nice background as to why they did what they did. But then go way beyond the incident and talk about all the years afterwards, what life in camp was like after the incident, because things got a whole lot better. And then, once they go home, that's not the end of the book. Then what happened in the years afterwards, sorting the place out, turning it into a memorial area, the Japanese coming back, all of that other stuff, all of that into one book. So it's a definitive book on the whole thing. It will be non-fiction. I don't do fiction. I'm not good enough yet. But
I did kind of realise that most of the texts were about the incident and were generally fiction or like a novel.
Yeah, the problem with the incident, as they like to call it, there's so many different sides to it. There's the Japanese side, there's the New Zealand side. So in terms of a book, you will tell both sides and you will leave it at that. You don't pick one. Basically non-bias on the whole thing. You say, well, this is the Japanese side of the story and this is the New Zealand side of the story. You're not saying, well, this is the right one. But we've got, I've got a few accounts of it from different people. So between all of them, they'll tell the whole story, but you don't put yourself into it and say, well, this is what happened. Let the reader decide what they want to decide, give them all the information, and they can make that decision.
So do you have any sort of timeline, any sort of plan on when you think it will be done?
No. Like I said, I want to do, you don't want to, it's not going to be 10 years. Hopefully, maybe 2.
Yeah.
But it's going to require a lot more trips to Wellington, digging through all of their archives. I've copied a heap of stuff already, but there's a lot to go. But essentially go there, everything that's related to the Featherston camp in World War II, we're copying cover to cover. We'll look through it in detail later. But that way we've got everything, and then we can go from there.
Well, thank you very much for talking with us today, Mark. is actually only going to be part 1 of the Featherston episode, because I want to go a little bit more in detail into the actual objects that you can find at the Featherston Museum, and I will be doing that in the next episode. So I will see you guys there. Bye.